Welcome to our webinar on opening up the private rented sector. This is one of our annual webinars sponsored by the Oak Foundation, who we've got a really close working relationship with and who support us in our homelessness prevention policy and research and influencing work. This session, we wanted to focus on the private rented sector because we're seeing more and more private rented sector issues coming through our casework in Shelter Cymru. Just to jump in and let you know, there will be a recording of this. It is being recorded at the moment. I hope that's okay with everybody. And we'll be putting it on the Shelter Cymru YouTube site in due course. You can answer questions anonymously or using your name as well. So so you can be anonymous in this process or not, as needs be. As I was saying, we're seeing more and more PRS coming up in Shelter Cymru's casework. It always used to be around a third of our casework was private rented, but in recent times that's gone up. And at the moment it's actually 43% of our casework comes from the private rented sector. We're going to get into some interesting discussions this afternoon about trends in the sector and what's happening, whether things are shrinking perhaps. But one thing I can tell you is it's certainly not shrinking in terms of Shelter Cymru's casework, I can tell you that. So this afternoon we're going to be listening to a variety of different speakers with different insights to share, and that the theme is about opening up the private rented sector. We're going to be talking about Shelter Cymru's new campaign around discrimination, and we're going to be hearing some new research, also some insights from Ireland about how rent regulation is going on there. This webinar is very much a forum for honest discussion and debate. I think when it comes to PRS policy, it's always going to be about progress, not perfection. And I think the more we can be honest and share what we really think, share our fears and share our concerns and share our ideas, the more we can do that, the more productive this session is going to be. So I would really encourage all of you today to be open about the challenges and opportunities that are facing us, and get stuck into those the Q&As as we go along. So we'll be hearing from each speaker in turn. There'll be a little bit of an opportunity to ask some questions of each of the speakers, and then more kind of chewy questions you might want to consider saving those up for the end when we have the panel discussion. And I just want to thank the Oak Foundation before we move on. They've sponsored this webinar, and as they have done with so much of our policy and research work in Shelter Cymru, we've achieved so much in recent years through their support that we could never have done otherwise. So so thank you very much to the Oak Foundation. And I think on that note, I will introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Dr. Tom Simcock from Edgehill University. Now, some of you may have come across Tom before. He's been a very prominent voice in terms of research and policy and scholarship around the private rented sector. He's given evidence to a number of Senedd panel sessions looking at, if memory serves, it was the amendment bill on increasing security of tenure, among other things as well. And Tom today is going to be sharing with us an overview, setting some context to look at some of the well-known barriers to private renting. And I can see that Tom has just come up on my screen. That's wonderful. Everything's going so smoothly. I will leave you now with Tom and see you again shortly. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Jenny, for the lovely introduction there. And good afternoon, everyone. I'll just put my slides up onto the screen. So hopefully everyone can see these. So I've been asked here this afternoon to sort of set the scene and talk about what the evidence in the private rented sector sort of tells us. And so throughout this presentation, I want to talk about the changing private rented sector, and then go into and have a focus on some of those key challenges, have a look at issues around affordability and welfare reforms, look at housing and health, talk about the impact of the pandemic on private renters, and then also have a view from Scotland in terms of some of the latest research and policy changes that are happening in Scotland that can help us sort of learn in Wales where direction of travel could be taken as after other legislation comes into force in July. So I think one of the first things to talk about is actually the availability of evidence in Wales. And there's sort of limited high quality evidence and data that is Wales specific and up to date on the private rented sector. In England, we have the housing study, the English Housing Survey. I was going to say Housing Studies Association, but English Housing Survey, and that gives us yearly information on housing and housing profiles across England. But in Wales, there hasn't been that same data. There is data on housing stock, but getting into the nitty gritty around people's perceptions of how they live in their 10 years, there is sort of limited evidence on that. And this has been recognised by the Equality, Local Government and Communities Committee during the scrutiny of the Renting Homes Wales Amendment Act 2021. And there was calls across from Shelter and other organisations such as NALA to introduce a Wales housing survey to get us better evidence on private renting in Wales. However, we can learn about issues in private renting from across the UK and beyond, where there are those similar economic and regulatory regimes such as Ireland, Australia, USA, Canada. And the UK in itself gives us an opportunity in terms of sort of a natural experiment in terms of how regulation is diverging and those experiences. We've got Scotland that have already introduced the private residential tenancy agreement scheme back in 2016, which removed Section 21, the equivalent of Section 21 no-fault evictions. So that's changed security of tenure in there. And there's opportunity to learn about how different regulatory regimes in the UK affect renters as well, and what we can do to improve things for households going forward. I think one of the places to start is to talk about how private renting has changed. If we look back at way back in 1918, over 100 years ago, private renting was the dominant tenure. And then over time, that has declined until sort of the late 70s, early 80s, to where it was a minority tenure of around 9.1% of people lived in the private rented sector. This was because of World War I and other political changes that led to greater regulation of the sector, including the introduction of rent controls, but also the focus on home ownership as a key political sort of message and impetus to sort of keep people going and as a way to change how people's lives were. And then in the 80s, obviously Thatcher's deregulation agenda and market agenda was introduced into the private rent sector to increase investment and standards. Whether standards have increased, that is another question. So over time, it has then started to regrow. Most of that has then been over sort of in the 90s with the introduction of buy-to-let mortgages. But the real growth, I think you can see from this graph, is after the global financial crash in 2007, 2008 and onwards, where then it's increased to 20% of households and sort of then plateauing and declining slightly over the last year or two. So as I said, the last 30 years have seen significant transformation of housing provision. We've had the decline of social housing with right to buy, and then the increase in the PRS. And it's now providing housing to over 4.5 million households. And this has been, as I said, spurred by regulatory, economic and political changes, including deregulation of rents, introduction of the ASTs and Section 21 repossessions. But I think the main thing has been the availability of buy-to-let mortgages and then the global financial crash as people are shifting their investment, moving away from other investments into more stable investments such as housing and assets that aren't buoyed in terms of market conditions as such. So let's consider who the demand side characteristics of the private rent sector, the customers of the private rent sector. And I think there's growing recognition of the importance of the private rent sector across the life course and long-term housing provision. And I think our economic and social context is leading families and households to depend on the sector for longer. We've seen people living in the sector for 5 to 10 years, a lot longer than that initial sort of transient short-term tenure that it was previously associated with around students or young professionals. And so PRS housing has become more important there's low-income families, families with children and older people. And as you can see here from Ruggan Road's submarket to the POS, you can see that there's a lot of different people being housed in the private rented sector. And I think one of the key things to consider here is what McKee et al. Argue, is that the experiences of the private rented sector are shared across all these groups, but it's more acutely experienced by those who have limited social, economic and cultural capital, those who don't have the financial resources to be able to keep moving houses if they experience problems, if putting down new deposits for another property if they have a problem with their landlord or letting agent. And so it's those conditions can make the private rent sector very acutely negative for certain households. And I think that is one of the things that we should consider throughout our sort of discussions on the private rent sector. And when we're thinking about regulatory reform as well, thinking about how regulations are affecting those who don't have the means to defend themselves against that sort of power imbalance that currently exists. So we'll move on to our first challenge, affordability and welfare reforms. Renting in the private rent sector is more expensive in comparison to other tenures. I think most people are probably aware of this, the difference in costs and the amount of household income that's spent in terms of renting in comparison to owner occupiers or in the social rented sector. And since 2015, UK rental prices have increased by nearly 12%. And I think house prices have increased quite a bit more as well. In terms of when we look at household income, I mean, this is data from England in terms of the English Housing Survey. I think it gives us that information in terms of across the UK as well, in terms of those differences. So for the household income was 33% for private renters, compared to 27% for social renters, and a lot lower for mortgage owner occupiers. 61% of private renters reported they had no savings. This was pre-pandemic as well. There is differences later on in the slides, which I think will highlight some of these changes as well. 28% of private renters reported they had difficulty in paying for their housing costs. So there is real significant issues in terms of affordability in the private rented sector for households. Nearly 1 in 3, or just over a quarter of renters report they have difficulty in paying their rent. And so there's concerns over the large proportion of renters who could afford to cover mortgage costs, but unable to save for their deposit because of the high cost of living in terms of the amount of income they're spending on their housing costs. But there's also, I think, concerns over the new zero deposit products. These services can be more expensive over the long term in comparison to a standard 5-week deposit. If you put down, let's say your rent is £500, you're putting down £650, £700 deposit for the property. You could, for one of these zero deposit schemes, you could be paying £30 a month and you won't see that money back. And then if there is damage to the property, if the landlord says, oh, you've scuffed that carpet or something, it needs replacing, they will then come and charge you on top of the money you've already paid. So that's another affordability issue in terms of some of these products and schemes. And then we have welfare reforms and the PRS. I think this is an ongoing saga in terms of some bad decisions and poor decisions in terms of they've affected some of those people who really it shouldn't have affected. In 2008, the UK government implemented housing benefit reform and introduced local housing allowance rates. And then since 2010, with the election of the coalition government and then subsequent Conservative governments, there have been a raft of welfare reforms to LHA rates and universal credit. So LHA rates was limited to CPI increase, then 1% uprating, and then a 4-year freeze to LHA rates. We had the expansion of the shared accommodation rates to all single under 35s who claim benefits. So if you live alone, you're under 35, you can only claim the rent for a shared room. You can't, if you're renting a 1-bed property, you would have to find money to top up what you'd get to cover your rent. And then we have the bedroom tax in the social rented sector, household benefit cap and subsequent reduction in 2015, and then the rollout of universal credit, which was plagued by issues and problems. Some of them have been fixed now, and is running a little bit more smoothly, but there are still issues with universal credit. And Rugg and Rhodes argue that changes to LHA rates have effectively decoupled our benefit system from covering adequate rental housing costs. And it's a sort of a de facto rent control system that's imposed on the customer side, on the demand side, rather than the supply side, which is, I think, really sort of part of the problem that we're having in terms of homelessness from the private rented sector. With COVID-19, the government have increased LHA rates back to the 30th percentile, however, have now frozen LHA rates again, which will, as we know, continue to put families at trouble, especially with the rising household costs in terms of energy and everything else that's going on. And as we know from today, the increase in inflation as well. So that's all going to put pressure on low-income households and those who claim benefits to top up their incomes as well. And so what has been the impact of welfare reforms? Well, we know previously that evidence that LHA rates doesn't cover the lowest rents. CIH back in 2018 found that 90% of LHA rates didn't meet the 30th percentile. We found that 65% of landlords said there was a gap between the LHA rates and the rent was at least £50 a month. And colleagues at MMU found that landlords were likely reducing the availability of affordable properties to low-income rent tenants. We found that rent arrears had been increasing in terms of universal credit or tenants that had been on universal credit in the past 12 months. And we found that rent arrears were likely to have begun after a new claim from or migration onto universal credit, rather than that rent arrears being there previously. And around 1 in 3 landlords had reported to us that they'd evicted tenants on universal credit in the past 12 months, but the main reason reported is rent arrears. So I think getting this system fixed is a key priority to ensuring that people can stay in their homes for the long term. And I know that there'll be presentations coming up in a bit in terms of no DSS discrimination, but I think as we're talking about access to the private rent sector, this is, I think, a key issue. So just under 1 in 3 landlords had actively discriminated against tenants who claim benefits in the past 3 years. And I think this reflects the wider unwillingness to let to benefit claims by landlords due to welfare reforms. We found that twice the amount of landlords were unwilling to let to tenants who claimed universal credit over perceptions of problems with universal credit than those who had experienced issues with universal credit. So it's about that perceptual issue that universal credit isn't working, there's issues with it, so that we're not going to let tenants claim benefits, rather than people who've actually experienced issues with the management of universal credit. And welfare reforms are linked to overcrowding as well. A recent paper by Amy Clare found that reforms to local housing allowance rates was linked to an additional 75,000 households living in overcrowded PRS properties. So these welfare reforms are having significant impacts in terms of people's affordability and being able to stay in their homes, but also forcing people to live in homes that aren't suitable for them as well. I think another challenge in terms of affordability is the impact of short-term rentals and Airbnb. And it's a major challenge in specific tourist areas around this growth and the popularity, especially before COVID, that this was happening. In London, we found that there was a 571% growth in entire home listings on the platform from 2014 to 2019. But with COVID-19, there has been a 16% decrease by December last year. The tax changes in the UK to finance cost relief for private landlords make short-term rentals more attractive, alongside that they can make significantly higher profits without having to do much more investment into the property. So we're seeing a lot of pressure in seaside and tourist areas where local residents are being forced out of the property and out of their neighbourhoods due to conversion to short-term rentals in those areas. And this is termed as tourism gentrification in terms of those areas, and really affecting those communities and neighbourhoods. I think another key challenge is around housing and health. So the Marmot Review of 2020 identified that housing is an important determinant of health, and it's well accepted of the link between housing and health all the way back to Rowntree in 1971 and Britain in 1934. The recognition that it's more than physical housing factors that influence health, increasing focus on the psychological and social factors as well. And so I think there's that focus in terms of how we think about accessing and widening access to the private rent sector, we also need to be mindful around, we don't want to be putting people into housing that's actually going to make them worse and make them sicker in terms of its poor quality housing. So we need housing that is safe and free of physical risks, provides safety and security, that allows them to be part of the community, which is one of the good things about the Renting Homes Wales Act, around that 12 months security of tenure at the start, which will hopefully help people to allow them feel that they're now part of the community rather than this short-term contracts, and that perceptual risk that they might fear risk losing their home and not being able to put down those roots. But housing can also be a risk in terms of health. So there's domestic abuse and suicide, harms and homes. There's a great paper by Craig Gurney from University of Glasgow on that. There's housing insecurity, such as no-fault evictions in England and unaffordability, overcrowding, as I mentioned, around welfare reforms and the link there as well, and then poor property conditions. In terms of physical conditions of the properties, overcrowding COVID-19, analysis by the Inside Housing identified correlation between the level of overcrowding in councils in England and Wales and their COVID-19 death rate. Obviously living in overcrowded spaces increases your chances of transmission and reduces ability to self-isolate. It's also linked to broader social inequalities as well. We have over 1 million non-decent properties in the PRS in England, homes that don't meet these sort of basic standards in terms of the minimum standard they're set out by the HHSRS. They have a category 1 hazard present. They don't provide a reasonable degree of thermal comfort. They aren't in a reasonable state of repair and don't have reasonably modern facilities and services. And that isn't like, oh, it has to be the last 5 years. It's like 25 years, I think it is, for a bathroom to be classed as reasonably modern. So it's, you know, there is a lot of issues there around physical conditions that we need to consider in terms of improving the private rented sector for people as well. But then this comes down to issues with enforcement as well. And we have different approaches across different councils and the use of different regulations by councils as well. We found back in 2018, only 11% of local authorities had used the civil penalty notice in the first year that was available. So that I know that has increased slightly over the years, but it is getting local authorities to use their powers when appropriate in the right circumstances to ensure that renters aren't left in poor quality housing. But home is more than just bricks and mortar. Home is argued to provide a sense of ontological security. It's about having a sense of stability, security, and control over your home life. It's a place where you can then reach out and go out and live your life knowing that you've got somewhere safe to return to. And that's in previously, home ownership has been linked to higher levels of well-being. It's more than just being asked about having the permission to put up a picture. It's about having more control over how you live your life as well. And previous research has found that private renters find it difficult to settle down and create a home in the private rented sector around issues of insecure housing, insecurity related to Section 21 notices. And private renting can have a negative effect on the health and psychological well-being of renters as well. In terms of housing insecurity and health, research identifies that insecurity through Section 21 is experienced more broadly and impacts on the landlord and tenant relationships. So recent research from in Ireland found that while insecurity is a function of the legislation in market context, how tenants experience that insecurity is in the context of the relationship with their landlord. I think that's really important to consider when we talk about accessing the private rent sector. Is, you know, there is all this legislation market stuff that's going on, but really, you know, on that front line, it is that relationship that tenant has with that landlord. And so if there are issues around poor property conditions, people, you know, tenants might try and avoid that conflict in terms of raising property condition repair issues in fear of a negative outcome from the landlord. Either they're not going to repair it, or they increase the rent if they do repair it, or they evict them so that they lose their home if, you know, if the landlord's not happy that they have to come and do a repair. I mean, they are sort of really negative potential outcomes, but it's that sort of insecurity and the fear and perceptual fear of that relationship in terms of the power dynamic as well. A report in 2020 by Professor Phil Brown at University of Huddersfield called Rundown, Lockdown, Breakdown demonstrated the experiences of renters living in poor quality non-decent homes. And this again confirmed around issues around renters not reporting repair issues out of the fear of rent increases or evictions. And as said, 15% of renters live in overcrowded properties, in which inside housing identified that relationship between overcrowding and COVID-19 related facilities. So there is real issues around issues in terms of housing and health. So what has the impact of the pandemic been on tenants and landlords? So I think it's important to say that we have had the furlough scheme, that in terms of the flagship support scheme throughout the pandemic, it has now been closed off last year. This covered 80% of an employee's pay. Now, while this will have prevented serious financial hardship for most households in the private rent sector, it does cause some problems. Private renters pay higher housing costs as a proportion of their income in comparison to other tenures. So if your household income is being cut by 20%, you are then going to have to pay more of your housing costs into rent, which could then have a knock-on effect throughout the pandemic in terms of other income you've got to spend on other household costs. And so we found that in terms of the wave 2 of the MHCLG English Housing Survey, the Household Resilience Survey, the increased in terms of household costs, how much was spent on rent from household income was 36% of income in November, December 2020. And as the Resolution Foundation said, renters were cutting back on other areas of household spending because of the drop in income. So I've used here the Household Resilience Survey Wave 2 for November, December 2020, because I think this illustrates, some of those key issues for private renters. There is a Wave 3 survey, which was April, May 2021. I think this illustrates some of those key issues, underlying issues in terms of the financial insecurity for renters in the private rent sector. So 22% of renters reported their income had dropped by at least £100 a month. 18% of renters report their savings had decreased, and 74% of renters reported having no savings, which was an increase from the English Housing Survey of 2019-20. I think it was in the mid-60s, like 69%, I think it was, as I talked about earlier. And so, that's an increase of renters who are having to use their savings to cover household costs and expenditure. 5% of renters become unemployed, and 9% of renters at that point are in rent arrears. That has now dropped down to 7% of renters, but MHCLG, or the new Department for Living or Housing Communities, have said that that actually isn't a statistically significant decrease in the drop in rent arrears. And what has been the effect on landlords? Well, 34% reported lost rental income due to the pandemic, and 13% reported increased void periods due to lockdown. Not all landlords are in a position to offer sort of forbearance to rent arrears, and 45% only have one property, and 77% have income below £50,000. So I think expecting all landlords to be able to, for a long period of time, take on rent arrears issues was a bit of a problem going forward in terms of the financial viability of some of those landlords. But it is also important to remember that landlords are in a stronger position than tenants, as they still have that asset that is increasing in value by approximately 3 to 5% each year. So they are still making money on that property, that they could sell that property as well if they really needed to. And so a view from Scotland. The Scottish Government has introduced their policy of Housing 2040. And as part of that, they've announced a draft rented sector strategy that is currently under consultation. It was launched in late December, and that seeks to improve the sector above the introduction of the Private Residential Tenancy Scheme, the PRT, which removed the equivalent of Section 21 no fault evictions, and also they also introduced broader reforms to sort of the housing tribunal and ensuring that all things went there for the private rent sector. And as part of this consultation and this draft rented sector strategy, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, in partnership with the Scottish Government, commissioned a research team led by myself at Edinburgh University and the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence to learn what are the challenges faced by low-income renters and to co-produce workable policy solutions to those challenges that have been found. And so as part of this project, we're taking a mixed method study over 2 phases, and just tell you very quickly about this. So phase one is about developing an understanding of those key challenges, looking at an evidence review survey of private renters and interviewing focus groups with renters. And then phase two is a deeper dive into the challenges for these different groups and the co-production of those workable solutions that I mentioned. And that's focusing much on qualitative interviews with renters and co-production workshops. And what have we found so far? Well, the initial findings show a nuanced picture of the experience of renters in Scotland. There are many renters who do have positive experiences, but there are also renters who do not. And I think part of those challenges is finding out, around those issues, that those renters who do not have those positive experiences, what they are, and how we can develop solutions to improve that for them. And three key early themes that in this are around access in the private rental sector, affordability, and property conditions and repairs. And I'm just going to talk about access in the private rental sector, as I think that's pertinent to today's talk, and we've already touched on issues of affordability and property conditions and repairs throughout the presentation as well. So what did we find in terms of access in the private rental sector? Well, it's a particular challenge for a range of different reasons. Firstly, there's discriminatory practices, and these are increasingly difficult to address, either because they are legalised, for example, right to rent in England, which hasn't been rolled out to developed governments yet. There is digitalised in terms of discriminatory practices, in terms of how people use sort of different referencing techniques or different screening techniques to identify who and who not to let out property to. And there's some of this that's difficult to separate from landlord discretion, such as around DSS and welfare reform and those who claim benefits. From our survey, we found that 7% of renters surveyed, and this was a survey through YouGov that was looking at all renters, so it wasn't just focused on low-income renters. So 7% of all private renters surveyed had experienced landlords or letting agents that did not want to let to tenants on benefits, which is still, a large proportion of, in terms of renters, they were having those negative experiences there. But there are also other challenges faced by renters when trying to access the private rental sector. For instance, pets. Nearly 1 in 5 renters surveyed reported they'd had difficulty finding a landlord's letting agent that would allow them to have pets, which goes back into that idea about health and harm in terms of having a home in the private rental sector, and having a pet is one of those having the ability and control over your own life to have a pet is one of those key things that allow people to make a home in that property. But there's also issues faced by renters just to access the private rental sector, and these are further exacerbated due to the difficulty in accessing other tenures. 44% of renters surveyed told us that they rented privately because they had no other option. It was their only option. They couldn't access social housing, they couldn't access owner occupier, and it was the only option for them in terms of their housing circumstances. So briefly, in conclusion, private renting has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. We've had significant reforms introduced in Scotland. There have been other reforms across England and Wales, and there's some coming in Wales in July. The PRS as a tenure is important for different groups and household types. Many are living in the private rental sector for the long term. And there are challenges across the private rental sector around affordability and the rising cost of living, accessing PRS properties around discrimination, right to rent, no DSS discrimination, availability of properties due to Airbnb and short-term lets, and then issues around pets and other things there as well. But then we also have issues around making a home and the links to our housing and our health. And then there is the continued impact of the pandemic on renters. The Welsh Government has changed their loan scheme to a grant scheme, and so same with Scotland. And in England, there has been the rollout of a new fund late last year to be distributed by local authorities. And it'll be important to see how the take-up of that is in terms of improving people's lives as well, and hopefully helping to address some of those financial and economic concerns. But the regulatory reform is coming. So we have the implementation of Renting Homes Wales Act, and that's scheduled for July, which will improve the security of tenure for new tenants in Wales. And then we have the Renters Reform Bill in England, the white paper that is supposed to be published at some point this year. Not 100% sure when that is, but hopefully it'll be soon. And thank you, everybody. and hope you've got some interesting questions, and I look forward to answering them.
Thank you, Tom. That was really comprehensive and really nuanced as well. So thank you ever so much for that. I'm slightly conscious of time. So what I was going to suggest, if it's okay with you, Tom, I'm sure that there will be questions from the audience. Can I encourage people to use the Q&A function? Because Tom or other people, in fact, can answer your questions by text as we go along, so you can be having that conversation while we jump into the next speaker. There was one quick question that came through, not through the Q&A, but the chat. So if we just pick that one up quickly, where is the figure of 4.5 million? Is this the whole of the UK?
I think it is the whole of the UK, possibly. Or it differs between different sort of surveys in terms of where those figures come from, because obviously, due to sampling as well, there are differences, but it's widely accepted to be around 4.5 to 5 million in terms of the private rented sector across the UK. But no one really knows completely, which is part of the problem in terms of availability of data.
Isn't it just? And it seems even more of a problem in Wales, it seems. But thank you very much for that, Tom. I'm going to invite our next speaker to join us now, and Tom will be coming back later for the panel session. And as I say, do use that Q&A function. I can see that there's at least one question in there now, so get typing. Our next speaker is Rob Simpkins, who is the Shelter Cymru campaigns manager. So Rob is going to explore some emerging findings from our recent survey of private landlords in Wales, which is an exercise that we did with support from Rent Smart Wales. So he's going to be sharing some of the emerging findings. We haven't released this data yet, so you're the first to hear. We will be planning some press and media around this, because we are just in the final stages of developing our anti-discrimination campaign, public campaign, which Rob will tell you more about in just a moment. So I'll just wait for Rob to join us. Here we go. Okay. Thank you, Rob. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just checking that everyone can hear and everything is all going well. And with that, I'm just going to share my screen. Great. Okay. Well, hopefully this works. So thanks everyone for having me. My name is Rob Simpkins, and as Jenny said, I'm in Shelter Cymru's small but mighty campaigns team, and I'm just going to give you a quick run through of our upcoming campaign and some of the findings regarding ending discrimination in the PRS in Wales. So in terms of what the problem is, you can see there in cold hard numbers yourself. But in our 2021 housing emergency research, 75,000 people experienced discrimination when trying to find their current home. And obviously, the Rent Smart Wales Code of Practice stipulates that prospective tenants must not be treated less favourably than any others. So the surveys and obviously anecdotally from our casework indicate that discrimination in the PRS is still an issue despite all the existing laws and regulations. And I'm sure we've all probably seen, or well, maybe it's just me surfing through Zoopla every day. I'm sure we've all probably seen the no DSS adverts or alternatives in that respect. So just to sort of kind of lay the problem out there in respect of Wales. Now, one of the sort of immediate responses is, this is just a minority, and this is just a couple of bad apples, right? Well, in some ways, yes, but no. So our recent survey showed that more than 1 in 3 landlords, so 36%, either prefer not to let to people entitled to benefits, or blanket do not let to them at all. Now, obviously, the black bar chart on the right hand side there is, I have no strong preference, and that's above 50%, which is a really positive figure. But it does indicate to us that there is a significant minority of landlords in the PRS who still retain some of this perception that Tom was talking about earlier in terms of letting to people who are entitled to benefit. And as again Tom said earlier, we're tackling quite an embedded culture here. So some of the quotes that we've got there are responses to our survey. So the 3 smaller ones around the outside are responses that we had through. And the larger one is cut directly from the article above it in Wales Online recently. I'm sure people have seen those. So you can see just from reading some of these that there's from, a fairly lackadaisical attitude towards people who are entitled to benefits, right the way through to, some of the more concerning opinions on there. The one in the top right, for example, tarring people with the same brush. Well, actually, research shows that around 50% of people in Wales are entitled to some sort of benefit. So that's a lot of people that we're tarring with the same brush there, up on that right-hand side. So benefits discrimination isn't the only sort of discrimination that we found coming through our survey. We surveyed, a bit wider to look at, sort of protected characteristics, and all manner of different things, really. So in response to the survey, nearly half of the respondents indicated that, they wouldn't or would prefer not to let to somebody who's been assessed as homeless by a local authority. A worrying amount, again, indicated they wouldn't or would prefer not to let to someone moving on from supported housing. And then the three underneath were what kind of really hit home for me reading through the results, was that, nearly 10% of respondents indicated that they wouldn't let to people of all ages. And that, small numbers of people indicated they wouldn't let to transgender people or to prospective tenants on the grounds of religion and belief, which are obviously, make for pretty concerning findings, even with a small amount as well. So yeah, it's concerning that it isn't just people who are entitled to benefit. This is, slightly wider and maps across, sort of marginalised groups, often with protected characteristics. And again, important to say that this is a minority, but still a significant one, and is having a real severe impact on people's ability to find somewhere safe to call home in Wales. So you've seen the data, and here are some of the quotes that we heard through the survey. Here are some of the responses, and sort of just after the quotes, who the respondents were referring to. So again, you can see through those quotes there are some really quite concerning opinions with regards to all manner of different people, and a healthy smattering of transphobia, misogyny, and ageism as well. So it really does demonstrate the depth and the strength of feeling in some respects, and puts into the picture the scale of the issue that we have to solve really as a sector. So thankfully it wasn't all bad, and actually there were some really positive responses, and as the first couple of slides show, that this is a minority, a sizable one at that in some instances, but we're seeing that this is becoming a marginalized group within landlords, and actually the vast majority are supportive of letting to people in spite of their situation. So some of the quotes on here certainly restored my faith in the sector, reading through the responses, and gave me that sort of warm fuzzy feeling. And I think that it's important to recognise that, especially some of the things that come through our casework of people in sometimes desperate situations, they aren't reflective of the entire sector as well. And I think what's important to recognise from some of these comments is that clearly, while there are issues, there are also, quite a lot of areas of common ground, and that's something that I want to quickly just roll over in the next few slides. And so, yeah, what now? Well, undeniably, the PRS has a vital role to play in helping us to end the housing emergency that we all face in Wales, regardless of what tenure that we live in. And no one can deny that, and it would be silly to say otherwise. In spite of the significant minority that we've just seen, the previous slide showed that actually the majority of landlords are compliant, and do seem supportive, and actually actively perpetuate good practice in terms of ending discrimination, and being good allies, and not discriminating against tenants for whatever reason. And as said, there's common ground here, an agreement, that this is an issue that needs solving. But actually also, and this is probably the most important part, on what some of those solutions might well be. So I will quickly whip through some of those. I think fundamentally and most importantly, and perhaps not surprising to anybody in this webinar, one of the main solutions is we need to build social housing, and we need to build more of it, make it more accessible. And so that's why obviously we're pleased to see the commitment across all the manifestos before May's election, but also now in a programme for government as well, for significant social house building on the agenda. I think as the Tom's slide suggested, I think we all need to recognise, and there seems to be a good amount of agreement across the sector on this, the inadequacy of local housing allowance, other forms of benefit, and work together to change this, because that benefits all of us. I think the next one is another important one, is recognise that there are a lot of people that are living in the PRS who might not necessarily that might not be the best place for them, but there's nowhere else to go. And we'll have a lot of unmet needs. And so we need to recognise the scale of this problem, and do our best to make sure that people living in the private rented sector with unmet needs receive the support that they need and that they deserve as well. And so I think, I'm not going to read them all out because, again, conscious of time. I think, the last point for me is an important one. We need to continue to raise awareness of these issues, and talking about them will hopefully help to destigmatize some of the conversations and some of the issues that we have. And we need to be good allies and recognize that, there are people in this position, and the impact that it has on them, because it's all well and good, this straight white boy talking about it in this forum, but I think, we need to learn from those with lived experience as well. So just a quick nod to the campaign that we're going to launch very imminently, looking at how we can tackle some of the issues that we've just talked through in those few slides there. So we are working in partnership with Rent Smart Wales and our amazing campaign supporters, our volunteers, and we're going to be launching a reporting portal for tenants who've experienced discrimination themselves. Or for people who, like me, tend to spend much of their life scrolling through Rightmove and Zoopla, who can report, blatantly unlawful adverts that we do see, the occasional ones that still have no DSS written across them. In addition to that, we've just completed some self-help toolkits. So if you or any tenants or prospective tenants that have encountered discrimination while they've been looking for a new home, then we've got self-help resources that people can use there and then to tackle the issue at hand. And then working in partnership with Rent Smart Wales, via the reporting function, we're going to take action against reported instances, and hopefully by doing all of those together, we can start to work through some of the issues, shine the light on some of the the bad eggs in the sector, and help people that are often in the most marginalised groups in our society to have somewhere safe and secure to call home, because you've probably seen it across all of our literature, but we believe that home is everything, and that without it, it's impossible for us to live healthy, happy, and productive lives. So realise that has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I will take some questions and take any points and that sort of thing through the Q&A function. And thank you all very much for listening. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was very timely and efficient, I must say. And it's been really good to see all of the discussion that's taking place in the chat function. It looks like there's some useful conversations taking place about insurance and so on and so forth. And it really does make me miss the days when we could, have a chat in the margins of a face-to-face webinar. And let's all hope that it won't be too much longer till we are in that space again. There are some questions in the Q&A as well. I'm a little bit conscious of time, but I think that we do have time probably for one question, Rob. There's a number here. I'm sorry, I can only pick one, and I feel bad about that. But there's a point here about the stats around discrimination. Are they actually higher because it's easy to price benefit claimants out of applying? So this is all that stuff around kind of de facto discrimination, isn't it? I don't know what thoughts you got, Rob.
I think that's a really good question and point, and actually something that probably needs further drilling down in. So in testing out the portal that we're about to launch, we've been doing a bit of scouring through advertising sites ourselves, and have seen, your standard working professionals only, no DSS, and a really interesting one came through actually today, which said LHA won't cover this rent. So I think, it is a really interesting one. And I think, part of the way that we have to tackle this is come together on some sort of shared understanding and agreement of, what constitutes discrimination, what constitutes, not setting somebody up to fail, and having that real clear communication. Because at the moment, it's so difficult to pin down what exactly it is, other than where it's really blatant. So I think, it is a real worry and concern. And I think actually some people just not being aware of their rights and actively flagging and reporting some of these instances will have an effect on that as well. And the numbers might well be very, very different, probably higher. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to move on now, but I know that there's a lot more questions in the Q&A. What I suggest is that you keep them coming, because we'll return to some of these questions when we do the panel discussion at the end. Okay, so do keep your questions coming along. We're going to move on now to introduce our next speaker, Anne-Marie O'Reilly. So Anne-Marie has very kindly come to join us today from Ireland, from Threshold Island. Anne-Marie is policy officer with Threshold. And Threshold Ireland, we feel a lot of affinity with at Shelter Cymru because they're a similar organisation to us in that they're giving advice and they're doing policy and campaigning work as well. But they're a much smaller operation than Shelter in England, as are we in Shelter Cymru. So we feel we've got a lot in common. Anne-Marie is going to help to enlighten us all about this interesting question about rent controls, which has come up recently. Mabon ap Gwynfor has been talking about it in the Senedd, and there is a promised white paper in the cooperation agreement. So it's something that we all really do need to get our heads around in Wales, especially looking at what's happened with private rents over the last year. So I'm going to bring on Anne-Marie now, who can tell us about the rent regulation regime in Dublin and I believe in other cities in Ireland as well.
Super. Thanks a million, Jenny. Yeah, so I'm based in our Dublin office. Lovely bit of Dublin there behind me, but we also have offices in Cork and Galway, two of the other big cities, but our services are national, so any renter in the country can get in touch with us. So I'll start off by sharing my screen. There we go. No, not a second. I need to do something else first. Apologies. I have too many things open. There we go. Okay, super. So yeah, I will be speaking about the experience in Ireland of rent regulation. So I will give you a brief introduction to the Residential Tenancies Act, which is the piece of legislation that governs the rented sector. I'll talk through the evolution of rent restrictions in Ireland, speak a little bit about the tenants' experience of those, and then take a look at, where do we need to go next. So all rent regulation and matters related to the private rented sector are found in the Residential Tenancies Act. And this act was first introduced in 2004. It sets out the landlords and tenants' rights and obligations, the manner in which rent reviews can be conducted, how a tenancy can be ended, the requirements for landlords to register tenancies with the Residential Tenancies Board, the dispute resolution mechanism via the Residential Tenancies Board. And the Residential Tenancies Board is a quasi-judicial body, but it is also the regulator of the private rented sector in Ireland. So the Act went unamended up until 2015, and 2015 is when the first rent regulations were brought in. And as of December 2021, it has actually been amended 10 times. So it's kept us quite busy. 5 of the amendments have related to rent regulation. So those are the ones that I've circled here. And these are the ones that I'll explore in the next few slides. And 4 of the amendments actually related to COVID-19 measures. So there was quite a bit done since 2020 to protect renters during the pandemic. So that first form of rent regulation was introduced in 2015, and this permitted landlords to only increase the rent once in a 24-month period, and this applied to sitting tenants as well as new tenants. So a landlord could not lawfully increase the rent between tenancies. And the notice period for a change in rent increased from 28 days to 90 days. In addition to this, the rent could only be increased in line with market rent. And to demonstrate market rent, the landlord is required to show evidence of 3 comparable properties to justify the increase. So that's what was set out in 2015. So I guess it's worth speaking about what prompted this. So there have been significant increases in rent throughout the country. You can see here, rents plummeted following the global financial crash, kind of bottoming out in about 2012. However, they recovered rapidly, and as we all know, wages did not. And so the average rent in Dublin and its commuter belt has actually increased by about 30% since the end of 2012. Or sorry, I should say between the end of 2012 and 2015. So just in 3 years. And so in money terms, that meant that renting in Dublin cost about an additional €300 a month by the end of 2015 compared to 2012. And approximately 50% of all rental properties are located in Dublin and the greater Dublin area. So it does tend to be an area of focus when we speak about the rental sector. There had also been an increase in the number of people entering homelessness in Ireland at this time, and in particular families with children. So the number of families recorded as homeless trebled between 2011 and 2016. And again, in numbers, that's an increase from 296 to 896, so large numbers. And the numbers of children increased from 498 to 1,720. So, and evidence indicated that the majority of these families lost their homes due to rising rents in the private rented sector and an inability to access a new home. So these were the kind of what was happening at the time as running up to the initial rent regulation in 2015. But the following year, the Dublin rents had increased about 11%, rents in the commuter belt had increased by 10%, and rents outside these areas had increased by 8%. So further action was taken to moderate rent increases, and these were in the form of what we call rent pressure zones, and these were introduced in December 2016. So in a rent pressure zone, a landlord may only increase the rent once in a 12-month period, and the increase cannot exceed 4%. Again, it applies to sitting tenants as well as new tenants. And all of Dublin and Cork City were designated rent pressure zones on the 24th of December 2016, and a sunset clause was included. So the designations were meant to come to an end in December 2019. And just in relation to that 4%, that's a bit of an arbitrary figure. None of us know how or why 4% was landed on. And also it was critiqued at the time because it permitted an increase every 12 months. So people said, well, it essentially guaranteed your rent was going to go up 4% every year. But that's what was set out in 2016. And there's actually a formula in place to designate an area a rent pressure zone. So the rent pressure zones are based on local electoral areas. So for it to be designated an RPZ, the rent increase in the local electoral area must have exceeded 7% year on year in 4 out of the previous 6 quarters. And the average rent must be in excess of the national average rent. So the Residential Tenancies Board, who collects data on rents, makes the minister aware when an area has met this criteria, and it is then designated a rent pressure zone by the minister. So between December 2016 and December 2017, 23 local electoral areas out of 166 were designated. And by the end of 2017, over half of rental tenancies were actually in a rent pressure zone. However, there were no designations in 2018, despite rents continuing to rise. And this was quite a concern for us in Threshold, but I'll speak about that in a little while. I just want to show you what, I suppose, the impact of this was. So, well, rents continue to grow. So I have here the top line is the rents in Dublin. The yellow is everywhere outside. It's the Dublin commuter belt excluding Dublin. Blue is everywhere else in the country. And then the national is, I've got myself confused now. Sorry, that's the national line there. Sorry, I got myself confused. But anyways, you can kind of see that they've all moved at a similar pace. It's maybe not it's not as the movements aren't as extreme, the jumps and whatnot compared to prior to the rent regulation, but the rents have continued to go up. So the overall the rents increased by about 20% in Dublin well, actually all around the country between December 2016 and June 2019. And that, again, that means that renters in Dublin were paying about an extra 300 a month. Those in the commuter belt were paying about an extra 200 a month, and those outside of these areas were paying an additional 150 a month. So in real terms, that's a good bit more to have to pay on your housing costs. So then that brought about more changes to the rules. And in July 2019, there were changes made to the Act, and that led to the measures were taken to basically enforce the rent pressure zone legislation, because indications were that some landlords were ignoring the rules and continuing to increase the rents as they wished. So a large number of amendments were made to the Residential Tenancies Act, and key among these were the creation of an inspection and sanctions unit in the Residential Tenancies Board, the creation of a number of offences for breaches of the legislation, and a widening of the rent designation criteria, and an extension of the rent pressure zones until the end of 2021. So the inspection team looks into possible breaches of the rules. If there's deemed to have been a breach and the landlord is unwilling to rectify it, then an investigation can be instigated. If the breach is confirmed, the RTB can impose a fine of up to €15,000 and seek costs of up to €15,000. And now that must be approved by the Circuit Court. So up to the end, so that team was established late 2019. I suppose it was only kind of getting stuck into its work when the pandemic hit. But since they began, well, by the end of Q3 2021, they had launched approximately 250 investigations, 90% of which related to breaches of the rent pressure zone rules. Now, only one decision has been confirmed so far by the Circuit Court, and there's approximately 50 awaiting confirmation. However, as a result of these, of the work of this team, just over $250,000 has been refunded to tenants or former tenants in overpaid rent. So that there certainly has, at least there's been that real life benefit for tenants who were overcharged in their rent. Now, at the same time, the rent pressure zone designation criteria was amended, and this was necessary as the original criteria required the rent of the area to exceed the national average before being designated. However, the high rents in Dublin and inflated the national average, meaning lower rent areas would never be designated despite ongoing and often large increases. So once this change was done, 19 more areas were designated rent pressure zones in July of 2019, and 6 more were added by the end of 2019, 7 more in 2020. So currently approximately 3/4 of all private rented tenancies are within rent pressure zones. Now there's been no designations since 2020. So we'll look and see what that did to rents. So it's getting slightly more level. The graph doesn't really give much away. So since July 2019, rents in Dublin have actually increased. Well, sorry, I only have up to Q2 2021, the Q3 report. I think I must have missed the Q3 report from the RTB, but certainly the increase is moderated. In the commuter belt, they increased by 11% and 15% everywhere else. But we do have to take the pandemic into consideration. Rents in Dublin dropped at the outset of the pandemic as people left the city to return to family, to work from home elsewhere, and many other reasons. For example, short-term lets coming back into the long-term market. What we have seen, though, is an increase in rents in other parts of the country, in particular the areas that are not rent pressure zones. And this is likely caused by the greater demand on rental properties as people moved out of the cities. So so that prompted the government to take further action. I know every country is experiencing housing issues, and I suppose it's very easy just to only look at your own country, but I suppose Ireland has been in an enduring housing crisis now for about 10 years. So this was a huge issue during the general election of early 2019. So there's been huge pressure on the current government to take action. So in July 2021, changes were made to the rent pressure zone rules. So instead of capping rent increases at 4%, the increases were linked to the harmonised index of consumer prices. And again, the rent pressure zones were extended to the end of 2024. However, by the end of October, inflation had increased, and that meant that a landlord could actually increase the rent by 4.6%. So the government responded immediately, and they passed legislation to cap rent increases in rent pressure zones at 2% to counter the increase of inflation. So that was enacted there in early December. However, the average rents do not tell the entire story. And I suppose what's very important in this is the data collection and having as much of the data as possible and for it to be precise. So this graph shows the average annual rent increase in different parts of Dublin. So breaking it down below the local electoral area level. And what it shows is that in all but 2 areas, the rent increases far exceeded the permitted 4%, almost 13% in some parts of the city. And this actually, this is data from the RTB, but it was a Dublin-based newspaper that did some research into it. And based on their investigation, it appears that these increases are linked to breaches of the legislation. It isn't other factors that are resulting in it. For example, new properties coming into the market which are permitted to, they would put up the price of the average rent. So at present, landlords are only required to register a tenancy when it's created. And so it does mean that we don't have the full picture of what the rents people are actually paying in the country. So we're hoping to see annual registration of tenancies begin this year, and this will provide a much clearer picture of the rents being paid and the level of increase or decrease. So just to go on then to the tenants' experience. So despite the rent regulations applying to new and sitting tenants, we have what we call de facto decontrolled rents between tenants. And this is because tenants are unable to independently verify the previous rent on a property. So they don't know when they take up the tenancy if they're paying the same rent as the previous tenant, or if the landlord decided to increase the rent in between tenancies. And because there's no way for the tenant to verify this, they can't challenge a potential breach to the rent pressure zones. So to overcome this, threshold has called for a dwelling specific rent register, which would allow tenants to check the previous rent on the property. Now, this proposal has been rejected as it's deemed that it would breach data protection rules. However, in Ireland, we have a property price register where we can look up how much was paid for any property in the country. So our argument is it's one and the same thing. And now we do hope that the inspection powers of the RTB will allow them to more effectively address breaches of the rent pressure zones rules, particularly when the annual registration comes into play. What we also see though is that many tenants are willing to accept unlawful rent increases. There's a real fear of conflict and eviction among tenants, particularly due to the shortage of properties available to rent. The most recent data shows that there were just short of 1,500 properties available to rent in the entire country. And that's the lowest it's ever been. It's the lowest it's been since 2006. So there's a severe shortage of properties to rent. And Dr. Michael Bird from UCD conducted research with Threshold in 2019. And he highlighted this issue and demonstrated how the fear of eviction undermines a tenant's agency to challenge breaches of the rules. And what we also see in Threshold is it's not unusual for landlords to issue invalid rent review notices. In 2021, 51% of the rent review cases that Threshold worked on, well, in those cases, we found 51% of the rent review notices were invalid. And so that's a quite common experience. So there is a need for verification and enforcement. And so despite the establishment of the investigation and sanctions team, we continue to see these invalid rent reviews come in, but we'll see how that progresses as that team becomes more established and expands its work. And then also, there's very little awareness of the rent regulation rules among tenants in particular. According to an RTB survey, only 35% of tenants surveyed knew about the rules. Awareness is much greater among landlords. 80% of small landlords, those who own less than 3 properties, were aware of the rules, and 90% of larger landlords also were aware of the rules. So I'm getting near the end. I'm kind of conscious I'm probably going a bit over time. So in regards to, we would hope then that the rent regulation would improve affordability in the private rented sector. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the case. Rents, as we've seen, have continued to rise, while the increases have been moderated, that they're still increasing, and rents are still at record highs. So in Threshold's 2021 tenant sentiment survey, we found that 51% of tenants were paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Only 24% were paying below that. And these tended to be the households in the higher income brackets. So last slide, where do we go next? So in Ireland, rent pressure zones are to end in December 2024. And there's a real concern that if the structural issues causing higher rents are not tackled and the rent pressure zone is not extended further, that there will be ongoing and possibly much greater rent increases. And as renters have few alternative options, they'll be forced to pay these, or we may see an increase in homelessness. And this is already mentioned before, the most long-lasting measure to reduce rents and improve access to housing is through the provision of affordable housing via the government and the approved housing bodies. So the government in Ireland has committed to delivering just over 87,000 new social housing homes between now and the end of 2024. That includes a mix of cost rental and a few others, affordable purchase being one also. But with almost 62,000 households on the social housing waiting list and approximately another 60,000 living in the private rented sector with some form of social housing support, it's unlikely that this new supply will have significant enough impact to justify the rent pressure zones coming to an end in 2024. So the government has laid out a 10-year plan to deliver approximately 300,000 homes by 2030. We may have to wait until then for rent regulation to come to an end. In regards of the enforcement, it's too soon to assess the impact of the investigations and sanctions team. As I said, the team wasn't in place very long when the COVID-19 hit, and then we had a moratorium on rent increases for a while. So them getting started, starting the work was delayed. We are concerned about the people who live outside the rent pressure zones, given the significant increase in rent, and which has likely been driven by people moving out of the cities away from the urban centres. Despite this change in working and living patterns, the designation criteria hasn't been updated or changed. So we have called on the Minister to review the designation criteria or make the entire country a rent pressure zone. So as I said, the long-term solution to addressing unaffordability is the increase of housing provision by the state and approved housing bodies. There are no mechanisms really to reduce or freeze rents, and there are already concerns that the rent regulations in place are driving small landlords from the sector, and any attempt to freeze or reduce rent would exacerbate this. In Ireland, 92% of landlords own between 1 and 3 properties, and they provide about 2/3 of all rental properties in Ireland. And we have seen a dramatic decrease in the available properties to rent and the number of tenancies registered with the RTB. So there is definitely a flow of landlords leaving the sector. Then just to touch on this, so institutional investors are making up a greater share of the rental market in Ireland. They dominate supply in terms of apartments. in 2016, the institutional investors bought approximately 6% of properties in Dublin. In 2019, that was 44%. So they're a much bigger player, and that really shifts and changes the dynamics, changes the market. So the housing sector, the private rented sector today, is a very different sector to what it was in some ways when rent regulation was initially introduced. And then finally, accurate data is essential to enforce the rules, but also in making decisions about where we go next with rent regulation. And that's it. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was so useful. There's loads of questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to have time to get into all of them live. But I'm sure, Anne-Marie, you'll have a look at the Q&A and pick some off to answer by typing. There's lots there for us to take away. I know you said that that you've seen some shrinkage in the PRS. How much of that do you think is linked to rent pressure zones? And can I add an addendum to that question as well? Have you seen any impact in terms of evictions, landlords kind of evicting so they could put the rent up more?
So the those that are leaving the market, because so many of the tenancies are in rent pressure zones, I suppose it's hard to tell. Is it a direct result of it being a rent pressure zone or not? But what we see actually in terms of notices of termination that come into us, at least approximately 45 to 50% are for the purposes of sale. So landlords are just exiting. And in Ireland, a landlord can only evict for a number of reasons: sale, for their own use, refurbishment, no longer suits the tenant's needs. So the majority are for sale. The landlords are simply selling up and leaving, and landlord representative bodies are saying it's because it's overly regulated and they're not making any money. And I suppose what we're seeing is perhaps many landlords were encouraged to buy properties as a long-term investment, as a pension, and they're now cashing in. Prices are at an all-time high. Negative equity is at an all-time low. It makes sense for them to cash in on their investment and exit the market.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's all about those, like you say, those kind of macro market forces as well.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was great. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to pick your brains more as we go down this journey. And I think it's really interesting to hear how the government has kind of tweaked and refined as you've gone along. It hasn't just been a done deal. It's been, it's been worked on and refined, which I think is a really, healthy way of making policy and legislation. Right, we're gonna jump on now. We are running a little bit behind, just to warn you, and I know that we are keen to finish at 3:30 and not to run on. So it might be that we have to slightly curtail some of the panel debate, but I'm hoping we won't have to. I'm going to introduce our final speaker at this point, Hugh Coken. Hugh is with the Bevan Foundation, and he's been doing some fascinating work on homelessness and local housing allowance. It's one of those rare times when we've got a project which is looking at a non-devolved issue, housing benefit, but looking specifically at what's happening in Wales. So I'm going to hand over, with no further ado, to Hugh when he shows up. Fantastic. That's so smooth. Well done, everybody.
Hi. Shall I share my screen now? Probably the correct thing to do.
Great.
So yes, hi, my name is Hugh. I am from the Bevan Foundation, and we have been over the past year looking at a current project into the local housing allowance and how that interacts with the homing system here in Wales. Just a quick outline of the presentation. I know we're short on time, so I'll try and skip through some of this, but just a quick intro to the project, what the data that we've been researching tells us, the lived experience side of the project that we're looking at, so the interviews with people who are in housing at the moment, then a quick glance at the social housing sector and how that can play a role, and then also looking at how we can develop solutions to the LHA problem. Quickly, just a little overview of who the Bevan Foundation are, in case anyone is unaware. We are a think tank based in Merthyr Tydfil, and our role is to develop policy and practice solutions based in robust research and evidence, and be able to influence then stakeholders and government. Now, the project that we've been working on has been funded by the Lloyds Bank Foundation, and it has been looking at the role of the local housing allowance in causing homelessness, both in creating housing insecurity for people in the PRS, but also perpetuating this homelessness for those in temporary accommodation. In particular, we've been focusing on the experiences of people under 35 with zero dependents due to the unique pressures that this group faces. Now, I know Tom has touched on it a bit, but just to go over it again, the local housing allowance is the mechanism that is used to calculate the amount of housing benefit or the housing element of universal credit for someone renting in the private rental sector. Now, it is designed to cover the bottom 30% of a market area, and will vary depending on age, area of residence, and number of dependents. But we have seen in the past couple of years, both from 2016 to 2020, and more recently from 2021 onwards, a freezing of these rates, meaning that we're seeing the rates drop below that 30 percentile. The reason we're looking at under 35s is, first of all, they're subject to the shared accommodation rate. Now, the shared accommodation rate is tied to the cost of shared accommodation in a given area, and therefore is much lower than what someone may be entitled to if they were in a one-bedroom house. Secondly, before it was discontinued, they were not commonly found in priority needs systems, and so faced greater risks and a consequence. So the research that we've been doing over the past year, we have been sweeping data from rental market websites, such as Rightmove or Spare Room, as well as more informal sources like Gumtree or Facebook Marketplace. And we've done this in 10 local authority areas. We've also had interviews with numerous stakeholders, including Shelter, amongst other local authority and also citizens advice bureaus. We've also been conducting lived experience interviews with people currently in or experiencing the consequences of the local housing allowance. And we published our first report with some of the data findings that we had back in the autumn, and we have a second report that should be out in March, I hope. So, looking at what the data tells us, first of all, a quick caveat of the data that we have collected. As I said before, it is amongst 10 local authority areas. We didn't have the capacity to do all 22, and thus what we did was we chose what we believe to be a representative sample of different valley areas, different rural areas, different urban areas, and different coastal areas in order to get what we believe to be a representative sample. We are also, should note that the data we have collected from rental markets, and therefore does not represent people who are currently in accommodation, but rather the situation for someone who's trying to look for accommodation, and therefore what they can find on the market during the period that we searched. And if anyone wants to find out a bit more about the details of the data that we collected, you can find it in our report that was published in the autumn. But to get to the data, of the nearly 3,000 properties that we surveyed over the summer period, what we found were only 136 were actually advertised at a rate that could be fully covered by someone who's in receipt of housing benefit. Now, what this means is that people either have to wait in accommodation, unsuitable accommodation for longer periods of time in order to try and wait for something that's actually affordable, or they must go into something that is more expensive than what they can actually afford, and therefore must dip into different pots, such as what they normally pay for utilities or for food, or receive a discretionary housing payment. We also found that there was a local dimension to this availability. Flintshire, Gwynedd, and Cardiff were the best performers in terms of housing availability. However, they still weren't good cases. And of the local authorities we searched, there were no good examples, but there were certainly bad examples. Merthyr Tydfil, for example, had 0 properties that we found during this period that could be afforded. What we also found is that there was a great deal of various requirements that were mandated by landlords before people could rent in their accommodation. Things like guarantors, multiple months rent up front, excessive deposits, credit checks, minimum income checks, all posed a barrier for not just people who are who claimed housing benefit, but for a wider population as well. Now, of the properties that were fully covered by the housing benefit, only 61 were actually had no additional requirements, meaning that someone could both afford it using the amount just provided by housing benefit and also easily access that property. And this correlates quite nicely with the research that Shelter Cymru have done and have kindly shared with me prior to this. As we can see, there's a great deal of landlords asking for multiple rents in advance and also deposits, meaning that you have what will be nearly an excessive amount that you have to pay before you even get into the house. But also what we see is different requirements such as employee references, credit checks, and guarantors all being asked before people can access a home. So what this means that even if the LHA was sufficient, if it was at the 30th percentile, you still have these multiple barriers that would prevent people from being able to rent in a home in the first place. We also did a collection of many other elements. For example, we collected EPC ratings. And what we found is that the majority of houses that we surveyed had an EPC rating of D or E. As such, this will correlate then with higher utility costs and therefore put greater financial pressure on tenants. We also found that a few properties actually allowed pets, meaning that if you had a pet and you were facing eviction, your choice of housing is greatly reduced as a consequence. Now, what the data tells us overall is that the LHA system is largely insufficient to provide support for people who claim housing benefit. Coupled with this, landlord requirements were widespread and numerous, meaning that even if even if the LHA was sufficient, you'd still have a massive gap that you have to overcome. And this data is largely reflected in the experiences of the people that we spoke with. Just a little overview of what our lived experience side of things has covered so far. First of all, we've had 14 one-to-one interviews, interview participants, and we also had 2 follow-up discussions with 2 of those participants. Now, these are people who are looking to go into different accommodation. So one was trying to leave temporary accommodation, while another was trying to find accommodation after being evicted. Of these 14, 9 have been from temporary accommodation, 4 have been in the private rental sector, and 1 is currently living in social housing but has experience of the PRS prior to that. And we've also been involved with larger, broader housing-related focus groups, and so have a much larger data set due to these various groups. Now, the overwhelming, I suppose, theme from those who we interviewed was that financial pressure, and particularly the LHA or housing benefit, was a direct cause for a lot of financial pressure. What we found is that people oftentimes just couldn't afford to pay for their rent, and so had to dip into other pots. They mainly, the feeling was then to avoid going into arrears of the rent, because that meant eviction. So that's what people wanted to avoid above all, which meant that people had to cut down on things like food, and in some instances people had to avoid or were unable to buy things like clothes or transport to go to job interviews. And largely we found that this meant that, so what we found after that is then there was also a numerous amount of barriers and negative attitude from landlords. Now, Shelter Cymru's survey highlights this much better than our research could from the landlord's point of view. But what they found was that nearly half of landlords would prefer not to let to someone who was homeless beforehand. Now, what this meant is that the people that we spoke to in temporary accommodation, they also reflect this general amount of stigma that they experience from landlords. People said that they couldn't access guarantors, or that when they put their current address as a homelessness shelter, they would just, they were either point blank refused or stopped hearing any communication from landlords that they were trying to let from. What we also found is that people did often struggle with these various requirements. many people had to borrow money from either family or get a loan in order to be able to just pay for things like moving fees or deposits or for rent up front. And this all had later consequences in terms of the financial security. What we also found is that people would often sacrifice good quality housing in order to actually access housing in the first place. Where for many that we spoke to, the choice of either staying in a cold, damp flat or being in a hostel or a shelter was a very simple decision for them. What this meant is that in terms of financial pressure, there were often higher utility costs due to them having to heat a flat that loses heat so quickly, but also there was the effect on mental well-being. Living in poor conditions had an impact then on people's mental health, and therefore it was difficult for them to then try and get out of their situation from that. But we found a particular challenge in actually trying to find interview participants in the first place, especially for those in our target group of under 35s. Now, it was very difficult to find people who were not already engaged with services. And we assume that part of this is due to the fact that people don't want to talk about what could be a very traumatic experience in their life. But what we believe from this is that given the size of the problem that we think is out there, the fact that we struggled so greatly to find anyone who actually experienced or who would be willing to speak to us highlights a potential issue that people may not be able to access support or don't know that support is actually available. And we believe that this represents a greater need to provide PRS tenants with a greater voice and ensure that they have greater access to support. Now, we did also look, I've done a bit of work looking at the social housing sector in Wales. And this is particularly because from the interviews that we conducted, there was an overwhelming preference towards social housing. Now, even though housing benefit, universal credit and the LHA are reserved to the Westminster government, many of the policies around social housing are devolved. And so it represents an opportunity for the Welsh Government to work around some of the restrictions in place by Westminster. In particular, it is due to the fact that the local housing allowance doesn't apply to social housing, it allows the Welsh Government to work around that system altogether. In addition to that, the people that we spoke to also mentioned that the fact there was increased security of tenure, higher standards of quality in the housing and less financial pressure. Now, social housing is not perfect, but certainly for those that we spoke to, it was definitely preferable to living in the private rental sector. However, there is a massive shortfall in the amount of social housing stock. Looking at the single bedroom housing, there are 1.5 times many more people who are in receipt of housing benefit who are single with no dependents than there are of one bedroom housing. Coupled with this, there is a slow progress in building new homes. Over the past decade, there have been just 5,000 new one-bedroom social housing. So what we find from what we have found from our research is, again, the LHA system is simply not sufficient in providing adequate support for tenants in the private rental sector. Coupled with this, land requirements are acting as a barrier that prevent people who are trying to leave temporary accommodation from ever being able to get into housing, even if the local housing allowance was sufficient. But because there is a lack of social housing, many people have no choice but to look towards the private rental sector, meaning that people are trapped, therefore, in a cycle of a lack of housing. Now, we have been looking at trying to develop some solutions. The obvious solution, obviously, would be to uplift the LHA either to 30%, either to back to the 30th percentile, or up to the 50th percentile as it was when it was first introduced. Now, obviously, with the current Westminster government, we have our doubts on how realistic this call may be. So we then look to see what can be done at the Welsh level to ensure that the LHA is more fit for purpose. Now, what we found during some of our research is that there are serious issues within the way that the local housing allowance is collected or calculated. and specifically the data that is collected from rental markets that is used to set the LHA, we believe is too small a data set to be able to accurately represent the experiences of a rental market. And so therefore we believe that making it mandatory for landlords to submit how much they rent their properties out for will allow us to be able to improve the data collection and have a more accurate local housing allowance rate. Similarly, we believe that devolving the setting of BRMAs, these are the areas in which the local housing allowance apply to. We believe that by doing so, we can have more accurate market areas, and therefore the LHA will be able to more accurately represent the trends within a different market area. An example of one market area that could be improved is currently Torfaen. Now there is one market area, Torfaen, despite the fact that they have quite a more affluent area in Cymru, and I suppose less affluent, for lack of better words, area up in Blaenavon. Now the LHA has to take into account both of these areas and therefore can't be accurate for the whole situation. But we also believe that there should be more help for renters dealing with some of the requirements that we've spoken of, ensuring that there is a way for tenants to access guarantors or deposits could be a way of overcoming some of these problems. And we know that some local authorities are also using different schemes to appeal to landlords to address these factors, but also addressing the stigma towards many housing benefit tenants and people leaving temporary accommodation is a necessary step to make sure that people have access to adequate housing. We're also looking at different ways that the social housing sector can be used as a tool to improve the Welsh Government's homelessness policy. Now we're looking at different ways to increase the means of increasing stock, such as looking at modular housing or converting old properties. But we're also looking to see how efforts to build 20,000 new homes can be measured and also improved upon. And also we're looking at different ways to reassess the allocation system to make sure that it is accurate enough and ensures that the people who are most in need are able to get the housing that best suits their need. And to do this, we are hosting a number of different discussion groups of stakeholders and people with lived experience. And we're also exploring different examples of good practice from different local authorities across the UK and also worldwide to see what can be done and replicated here in Wales to ensure that people have access to adequate housing. So that is my findings so far in a nutshell. As I said, there'll be a final report in March detailing a lot more of what we have found over this year period. And if anyone wants to email me with any questions or queries about the research or anything, or how you may be able, if there's anything you can do to help with our research, my email's on the screen, and please feel free to get in touch. Diolch yn fawr.
Fabulous. Thank you, Hugh. That's great stuff. I'm going to invite you, if you can stay on the stage with us, Hugh, I'm going to invite the other panelists to join us now, and we can start to chew some of these questions over. I think if you can stop sharing your slides. Yeah. There we are, fab. While we're waiting for the other panelists to rejoin us, I'm just reflecting on, there's a couple of things that have really jumped out, as they always do when I listen to your work. Number one, build social housing. It's like, it's as close to a panacea as you're ever going to get in terms of housing policy, isn't it? But it always comes back to build social housing. And the other point as well, which really jumps out at me, I've thought for a while that we need to get a better grip on private rents, because we might well be shortchanging ourselves in Wales by not having a really comprehensive understanding about what those average rents actually look like. And that data is so important because it governs how much local housing allowance we get in Wales, isn't it? And, you know, during times when there's not a freeze, of course, but I think that there's so much more we could do in that space just to make the most out of the housing benefit system. We were still waiting for a couple of extra panelists to join us, but I'm just going to, I think it's just Rob from Shelter Cymru who we're waiting for now. and Tom as well, sorry, so we'll just wait for them to join us. Can I introduce, these are all of our existing speakers, plus we've got 2 extra members here today. We've got Jill Owens. Welcome, Jill. So Jill is she's the regional representative for Wales from the National Residential Landlords Association, which is the membership body for private residential landlords in Wales. Welcome. And also Judith Jenkins, and Judith is a housing strategist working for Conwy Council, and has also got lots of experience on the homelessness side as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's reflections this afternoon. And can I invite members of the audience, please, to keep adding your questions into the Q&A. I think just to kick off, let's kind of get down to the nuts and bolts. We've been talking a lot about how landlords make decisions about who to let to. And we've been hearing about how different it is from social housing, where because we've got a finite number of homes and lots of people who need to live in those homes, in social housing, we've got a big focus on fairness, haven't we? And we've got national, primary legislation to make sure that those decisions are made in a fair way. In the PRS, it's very much left to landlord's own discretion, isn't it? And as a result, there's a lot of difference there between how landlords make these decisions. Is it time for us to look afresh at that? And is it time for us to consider maybe some regulation around landlord requirements, and perhaps something in the region of, I'm not going to talk about a PRS allocations policy because I'm sure that would be outrageous, but let's open it up for some thoughts from the panel. And I'm not going to go around and pick on everybody. I'll invite you to put your hand up or just start speaking.
Well, it might just be worth saying that some measures were taken in Ireland because of those additional barriers we were seeing being placed in front of people to access housing. So, traditionally it was a month's rent, and the equivalent of a month's rent as a deposit up front. But we started to see landlords asking for multiples of months rent up front as deposits. And that was certainly a barrier for lower income households. So the legislation was actually changed in July last year. So a landlord may only request the equivalent of 2 months rent up front, and that should cover the deposit and the initial month's rent. Now it's been in a short enough time, so we're kind of yet to see the impact of it, but it was kind of brought in quite quickly because this is an issue that particularly impacts students. Students were nearly always asked to pay a term's rent up front. Now, I suppose, again, that's a recent enough practice, but it became the practice. And so it was brought in advance of students returning in September. But what we found was a lot of providers just completely ignored it. And that included the purpose-built student accommodation providers, the ones who are doing it as a business. They just ignored it. So we've yet to see how it pans out.
Thank you. Yes, that's the point about regulation. It can always get ignored, can't it?
Yeah. I know in the part of the proposals in the new Renting Homes Act, they are talking about tenant passports, aren't they? Talking about helping tenants move from one tenancy to another without having to find a second deposit, which I think will definitely help in terms of having to find that extra money to move on.
Yes, absolutely. And there's just been a comment in the Q&A about local authorities sometimes being too slow off the mark to provide a deposit that secures a tenancy, and that's certainly something we've seen in our casework as well. So in terms of regulation around all of this, we've already got in the Rent Smart Wales Code of Guidance, there's already quite specific guidance there around discrimination and reminding landlords and agents that it is unlawful to discriminate according to protected characteristics, and yet it's still happening, isn't it? And I would like to hear panelists' thoughts on why this is the case and what we might do about it.
Hi. Okay. Could I just have a word on that? I was interested to see Rob's presentation with the classes of discrimination that he has identified. And I would say that I know presentation time is small, but I do think we need more context. For example, if we have a landlord who specialises in one-bed properties, he is very likely, or she, to say, not so happy to take the pregnant woman because in a short space of time, that little household will require 2 rooms. Social landlords do it too. They won't take a pregnant woman and put her in they won't set her up to fail in the longer term. So these considerations need to be taken. Also, I suspect from the nature of your presentation that the people you questioned were ticking boxes about types of groups. And I think very much that landlords, at the time they make a letting, look at the potential candidates before them, or they select from the type of person they think would be their best tenant. And it's very difficult when they don't know the individuals to come up with that nuanced open doors. So I'm not expressing that well, I'm trying to be brief, but we do need context for landlords' decision making when they choose one type of person or group over another. They only have one vacancy and they only have to whittle it down to one candidate for that tenancy. And so every single time they make a decision as to who's going to be their next tenant, they are discriminating. But whether or not it's a criminal type of discrimination, that requires more nuanced attention. Sorry, went on.
No, that was great. Thank you.
So I think the point, Judith, about extra context is, trying to fit, it's such a wide topic, trying to fit that into 20 minutes or less. You're absolutely right, and I think we'll be publishing the full report I think later this month or early next month, which will have additional information in there and give a much richer flavour of the data in the survey. So yeah, I would say look out for that when it's coming, and that'll give you a much better picture than I can certainly try and do in a rush presentation. I think with regards to some of the points made there, I think, look, we appreciate the pressure in the PRS. As someone living in the PRS at the moment, is just, I've never known anything like it, in the few years that I've been here. And I think, the number of people in the presentation, we saw the scale of the issue with a number of people, essentially scrapping for one property in one place. I think, that obviously, the risk there is around, from my perspective, and just worrying about that is, does unconscious bias sometimes come into play, with regards to that process? Are landlords picking tenants, purely based on, there'll be the less risk, which I think, to some people is entirely understandable, but what formulates that process? How do landlords reach that decision? And I think it'd be really interesting to unpick further, how people reach that. Are we seeing some of these, sort of cultural, structural, sort of barriers in play there, and what more can we do as a sector to try and, tear some of those barriers down, because otherwise, we're going to see inherently people that look like me, who don't suffer from discrimination gaps, in terms of wage or anything like that at all, who are going to be pushed out of a sector in a housing crisis and a housing emergency. So I think, it's a really, really interesting point, and how we work together to bridge that gap. I'm all ears, certainly, but I think it's a really interesting one.
I can imagine Jill. I can imagine Jill's itching to get in. I'm just going to come back with a tight thing. As someone who has to encourage these conversations with our landlords so that we can resettle people from the homeless team, from other places, for all sorts of things, we have got to have a direct conversation with landlords and meet them where they are and talk to them like human beings that they are, engaging in perfectly lawful activities to address their concerns, so that we can perhaps dispel some myths and things, and not setting barriers before them to be the best landlord that they can be.
Hi Bob, I was really interested because I'm an equality specialist in my previous life, and unconscious bias is really difficult because you will meet people all the time who say, I don't discriminate, I'm not biased. We are all biased, we all do it every day of our lives. We are biased, either for or against people. So how you tackle that with landlords is I think is a mountain to climb, because they will say they're not biased at all, and yet they can't help it. Personally, I've got pregnant ladies in my properties, and I prefer families to couples because they're big family homes. So I want them to be lived in as a family. I've also got homeless people in my HMO. So, it's difficult for me to actually talk to landlords, like Judy says. We need to have that conversation with them and challenge them, because very often they're saying, I'm not discriminating, until you start to pick away at them and have a sensible conversation, as Judy says, Yeah. I personally, benefit tenants would be my best tenants. My worst tenant was an accountant, so it's it's difficult for me. Then I have these conversations with landlords like Judith does every day.
That's great, and I was really struck, if I can jump in, that looking at our research and the qualitative feedback that we had, because we asked for a lot of it throughout the survey, and it's just so different, isn't it? And the number of landlords who are talking about, who are saying all the right things about how they make decisions, and it's based on the person, it's based on the individual, it's not based on where the income comes from, all of that stuff was really high. And I know you can't compare our figure with shelters in England because they're different methodologies, but we asked the same question wording, and their proportion is so much higher than ours in Wales. And it made me think that actually our culture might be a little bit different in Wales, that we're not as kind of dead set against renting to people who are in receipt of benefits as perhaps over the border. I've got there's a question from Viv Sugar in the chat, and then we've got a question in the Q&A as well. Vivienne is I know, Jill, you've answered this, but just so everyone, all the listeners can hear, do most landlords in Wales let directly to tenants, or is there widespread use of agents who may see the contract with the landlord as the main thing rather than feeling obligation to a tenant? And I think, Jill, you've said that there are still quite a lot of self-managing landlords, is that right?
Yes, there are quite an awful lot of self-managing landlords in Wales. But I mean, I think to make sure they're compliant, they need to start thinking about using an agent and making sure that they are compliant, fully compliant. I mean, most agents do, they have to be regulated by Rent Smart Wales as well. But they do need to think about it, because for the sake of a few, well, probably about £50 a month, they, for the sake of that, they are making sure that they are covering themselves and actually following legislation. The amount of private landlords who've got one or two properties really don't know the legislation, and we need to educate. That's part of our role, is to educate. Judith and I have this conversation all the time about upskilling landlords to make sure that they are following the law and they are compliant. And I think working with agents to help them with that, would certainly be an improvement.
I think that landlord licensing did encourage more landlords, didn't it, to go across to having a managing agent rather than doing it all themselves. It's really come through very strong this afternoon about how many kind of, not only landlords are accidental landlords, but how many tenants are accidental tenants as well. We've got so many people who perhaps haven't, perhaps because they would rather be in a slightly different situation. So do need some extra support to understand their rights and responsibilities, isn't it? We've got a question here from H Drinkwater, who is saying, I was hoping to get an understanding of how and when the private sector properties would become available to home seekers. Do you know how this will work?
I don't understand the question, sorry.
Yes, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps you could put in the Q&A a little bit of clarification for us, so that we can so that we can answer your question, H Drinkwater. We've got another comment here from Rachel to say this might be a controversial thing to say, although I love controversial things. You're always going to have an issue whereby landlords are looking for stable tenants who will look after properties and pay the rent. If you look, for instance, at Gwynedd, where the majority of people coming into emergency accommodation due to homelessness are single males who aren't in work, with a high number with a criminal record, on paper, they look more risky and potentially struggling with the rent. So there's a need for support to be in place, because landlords will have valid concerns about certain lifestyles and how that may impact on their property. I think this is a really important point about support, isn't it? Because
absolutely.
So we all understand that anyone can maintain a tenancy if they have the right support in place. But this is a big concern for landlords, isn't it? Go on, Gillian.
No, go on, Judith. I think.
I was just going to say that cohort, the single under 35-year-old, perhaps with a bit of a hint of some complexity in their life, are going to have difficulty because we just don't have one bedroom accommodation. And lovely as it is to discuss all these issues, the theme of the day is to open up the private rented sector. Yes, we can open it up, but it is on any one day a finite resource. For those that we assist into a tenancy, there will be those at the other end who aren't successful getting a tenancy. None of these things that we've talked about will increase the supply by one home or by one thing. And so we have to look at supply. We've talked about social housing and the building regime. Yes, we do need that, but we also need to look at how, as Tom mentioned, the short-term lettings, the nibbling away of supply by other activities. We've got short-term lets in some of our holiday areas. Wales is a beautiful country, people want to come. But also, and I've been frantically trying to find the paper all day, there was a paper about buy to leave. You know, this phenomenon in central London where foreign investors come, buy a block of flats and they don't let it because it's more costly to let than do that. That paper suggested that in parts of Wales, that was a cost-effective investment solution, and they suggested that on paper their model was looking at 2 counties in Wales, Conwy and Pembrokeshire, where that was a likelihood. And I'm rather suspecting that we're seeing this kind of behaviour. So we have to look at our overall housing supply and protect it for the private rented sector. We're losing far more to short-term lets than we are building.
Yeah.
And with that, my rant is over. Sorry.
Thank you for raising that. This is such an important point. We've got to think about the whole system, haven't we? And I know we're looking at holiday homes and second homes regulation at the moment, potentially, but it's a PRS solution as well, isn't it? Tom, maybe I could bring you in at this point, because you did highlight the gentrification effect. We're seeing so much of it in Wales.
Certainly. So yeah, definitely in terms of short-term lets and sort of the tourism gentrification in terms of those properties moving from the PRS to the short-term let sector, especially with tax changes, and then the ability, just, you know, if you have a property and you rent it out for 3 nights, you could probably get a week, 2 weeks rent just from those 3 nights. So it adds up quite significantly, and then that prices people out of neighbourhoods, and that has knock-on effects on other rents as well, because obviously as supply dries up, prices go up, and that prices everyone out of the neighbourhoods, unfortunately. So it's a huge challenge there, and major challenge.
We've also got the language factor in Wales as well, and we've got traditional Welsh-speaking communities that have been Welsh-speaking for hundreds and hundreds of years. Suddenly, no one can afford to live there anymore. So it's absolute tragedy.
I think there's another problem as well. What Judith is saying about the single males. There are a lot of planning departments in councils that don't like HMOs, and we've got a problem there that, you know, we're crying out for single occupancy and HMOs to accommodate these people, and then we've got the planning department refusing planning permission for HMOs. So something needs to be done there as well, I personally believe. Tom's nodding his head.
Yeah, getting that join up with planning, eh? Absolutely. I know we're getting on for 3:30 now, and I know that some of you have got to go off pretty quickly. So as a final question, can I make a suggestion? Because I think we've talked about so much common ground here today, and Shelter Cymru and the NRLA in particular, we've worked on joint projects in the past, we've campaigned on the right to rent and things like that. We all seem to be in agreement about the problems with LHA and that things could be done better. And in Scotland, of course, they've got administration of housing benefit and UC housing costs. They've got the Scottish Choices programme where tenants can have the choice to have the rent paid direct to the landlord, and they could have bi-monthly payments as well. And it just feels like something where maybe there's potential for some coalition work to call for something similar in Wales. What do we think?
Nodding.
Nodding heads.
Yeah, we're nodding.
That's good. I'm happy with nodding heads. Absolutely. I think that there are things we can do in Wales by being more clever and by manipulating, even though it's non-devolved, we can still manipulate that system to work better for tenants and for landlords. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to draw a line under there, and thank you everybody for the Q&A. I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to answer more of your questions, and I'm just so looking forward to a day when we can all be in a room together. The recording will be on the Shelter Cymru YouTube page, so look out for that. And it'll have all the slides and so on. We will send the presentations as well around to people. Can I just reiterate, thanks to the Oak Foundation. Thank you to all of the panelists today. All of your contributions have been fantastic and really useful to us at Shelter Cymru to refine what we do next. And before you all leave, I just want to give a very quick plug for the People and Homes. Our annual conference is going to be on the 28th of June in person in Swansea. Date for your diary. And also, if any of you are thinking about the Renting Homes Act and wanting to get some training on that, have a look at our website, because we're going to be launching some e-learning soon, and in due course some face-to-face training as well, so we can help get you up to speed on the legislative changes. Thank you all again, everybody. It's been a really good afternoon. Take care, everyone. Hwyl fawr.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.